25 years. For 25 years, every Friday, my daughter took $800 from my account and told me it was the money that kept me alive. Medication, tests, therapy, whatever excuse fit the weak. And I believed her. I believed her so completely that I never looked twice at where the money went. But 3 days after she moved out, the truth hit me like a blow I never saw coming. I went into her room just to tidy up what she left behind. The moment I opened the first drawer, I knew I was about to see something no father should ever have to see. Medical papers with dates that didn't match my own life. Doctors I had never heard of. Procedures I never went through. But none of that froze my blood the way the next thing did. A single envelope stamped medical authorization confidential. Empty. Completely deliberately empty, as if someone wanted me to find that emptiness. Not forgotten. Not misplaced. A message written in silence that my life had been steered by lies for 2.5 decades. I stood there in the middle of that room, holding that hollow envelope, realizing it was only the doorway. The first step into a truth darker than anything I had ever imagined a father could face. And once I followed it, I would learn exactly where all that money had really gone, and why my daughter fought so hard to keep me blind. I was standing at this kitchen sink that morning in late October, listening to the heater hum through the vents and watching a thin line of steam rise from my coffee. Springfield was waking up slow in that quiet, Midwestern way it always had, but my house felt different, quieter. Marilyn was folding laundry in the living room, humming a tune she used to sing to Emily when she was little. The sound should have warmed the room. Instead, it reminded me of how empty the place had gotten after our daughter packed her bags and left for Cincinnati. 42 years in this house, and somehow it never felt unfamiliar until now. When I turned 68 last month, I did not think much about age. I still mowed my own lawn, still drove up to Dayton every other week to meet old coworkers from the GM plant. I liked thinking of myself as steady, dependable, a man whose routines meant something. But routines can outlive their truth. I learned that the hard way. 25 years ago, I had that little stroke. Nothing dramatic. A sharp light behind my eyes one morning, a moment where the kitchen tilted sideways, and then the sound of Marilyn calling my name like she was far away. The doctors at Mercy Health said it was minor, not to worry, but I noticed afterward that certain things slipped through the cracks. A date. A password. The place I left my wallet. Nothing life-changing, but enough for Emily to look at me with concern a girl her age should not have carried. She was 18 back then. Smart, quick to take charge. She sat at the dining table with a stack of forms from Medicare and told me I should let her handle them. She said I had enough on my plate. She said healthcare was complicated. She said she would take the weight off my shoulders. I remember nodding, grateful in a way that felt like surrender. I trusted her. I trusted her so completely that it never occurred to me to wonder why she insisted on picking up the mail before I did, or why she always had an explanation ready when I asked about costs. She told me supplemental insurance had changed again. She said the scans were getting more expensive. She said the co-pays were unpredictable. Every time she opened her mouth, she sounded so sure, so protective. That was when the Friday withdrawals began. $800 every week without fail. She told me it covered the gaps Medicare did not. Physical therapy I did not remember scheduling. Routine scans I never saw the bills for. Paperwork fees. Prescription adjustments. She made it all sound necessary. Marilyn trusted her too. Maybe even more than I did. Emily had always had that effect on people. She could take the reins without making you feel like you were giving anything up. We let her handle it week after week, year after year. And somewhere in those years, the habit turned into a ritual. Something unquestioned, almost sacred. I would see the bank notification on Friday afternoons, and barely register it. Just another step in the rhythm of our life. When I look back, it scares me how easy it was to believe. Emily left 3 days ago. No fight, no dramatic exit. Just a suitcase, a new boyfriend in Cincinnati, and a quick hug that smelled faintly of the lavender lotion she always used. Marilyn stood at the doorway longer than I did, watching the car pull away until the taillights vanished. When she turned back inside, I thought I saw something like relief in her eyes. A soft loosening of tension I had not noticed tightening over the years. I told myself I imagined it. This morning, while Marilyn folded towels in the living room, I went into Emily's old room to dust the shelves. The sunlight through the blinds cut the room into narrow stripes, revealing dust in the air. The posters she once taped on the walls were long gone. Only a faint rectangle where a picture frame used to hang remained. It felt strange standing there among the ghosts of a girl who used to run down the hallway, laughing, wearing her mother's shoes, and pretending she was grown. On the floor near the bed, half tucked under a loose floorboard, I found a folder. Cream-colored edges worn soft like it had been handled too many times. Inside were copies of medical forms with dates stretching back nearly 15 years. The ink was faded. Some lines were missing. My name was printed at the top of each page, but the information did not match anything I remembered. Procedures I never had. Addresses I never lived at. Even the signatures felt wrong, like someone tracing my handwriting from memory, but missing small things no one would know but me. I stood there reading until Marilyn called from the kitchen, asking if I wanted more coffee. I said I was fine, but my voice caught halfway, and she did not hear it. At the bottom of the folder, I found an envelope. It was sealed crisp, newer than the rest. Across the front were the words, "Medical Authorization Confidential." The handwriting looked neat, deliberate. Emily's style. I broke the seal with my thumb, expecting forms, maybe bills she forgot to mail. The envelope was empty. Not a single sheet inside. No signatures. No explanations. Just a hollow space where something should have been. I held it up to the light, wondering if a page had slipped somewhere, but there was nothing. Only silence. And the sudden, unshakable feeling that the edges of my life had started to fray long before I noticed. I sat down on the edge of her bed, the envelope still open in my hand, and listened to the old house settle around me. It creaked the way it always had, but the sound felt different, like a warning I was only now beginning to hear. I thought I understood that Friday ritual. I thought I understood my daughter. But that empty envelope felt like the first truth I had touched in years, and it told me something I was not ready to face. Something was terribly wrong, and it began long before Emily ever left this house. I sat there a long while holding that empty envelope, trying to steady the strange tug in my chest. It felt as if the house itself was waiting for me to do something, to say something, to acknowledge a truth I had ignored for too long. By the time I stood up, the room had grown colder, as if the air knew what I was about to uncover. I walked downstairs with the folder pressed against my palm, every step heavier than the one before. Marilyn was still in the living room, smoothing the edges of a stack of towels. She looked up when she heard me, but I didn't tell her what I had found. Not yet. I told her I needed to make a few calls and stepped into the kitchen, where the morning light fell across the phone on the counter. The number for Kroger Pharmacy was one I had dialed 100 times back when I picked up my own prescriptions. It felt strange calling, as if checking someone else's life. I asked the pharmacist to look up my account and explain a few charges my daughter had told me about over the years. The woman on the phone answered in a bright tone, the kind people in customer service use as armor. But when I asked her about my co-pays, the armor cracked. She hesitated. Then she told me I had not paid a single copay in at least 15 years. Medicare and my supplemental plan had covered everything. There was no record of any weekly medication fees, no special scans, no sudden adjustments. Nothing. I thanked her even though I could hardly breathe. My hand shook when I hung up the phone. For a moment I pressed my palm flat against the cool countertop, trying to settle myself. I wanted to believe it was some clerical error, something simple, something fixable. But in my gut, I knew better. Marilyn walked in with a dish towel in her hands and asked if everything was all right. I avoided her eyes and said I needed to call the insurance company. She paused as if deciding whether to push further, then quietly stepped back. She always knew when to give me space. The woman from United Healthcare answered with the same cheerful tone as the pharmacist. I told her my name, my date of birth, and asked a question that felt foreign in my mouth. I wanted to confirm who was listed as my authorized representative. The woman typed for a moment, then said it had been my daughter since 2002. She sounded confused when I told her that could not be right. She read the date again, and this time she added that the form had my signature on it. She even described the scanned file, the crooked angle, the faint shadow across the page, an image I had never seen in my life. I ended the call before my voice broke. When I stepped out of the kitchen, Marilyn was standing near the hallway, arms folded, worry etched across her face. I didn't need to speak. She knew something had shifted. She told me she had once found opened mail hidden behind the chair in Emily's room. Letters from Medicare, insurance statements, things she thought I should have read. She confronted Emily at the time, who brushed it off and said she was helping me stay organized. And I, caught between wanting to trust my daughter and wanting to calm my wife, convinced myself it was nothing. I realize now that denial is a soft blanket warm enough to fall asleep under, but smothering just the same. I went to the medicine cabinet next. 8 prescription bottles sat in a neat row, each one sealed tight, labels unwrinkled. Some were dated 3 years back. If Emily had been buying my medication every week like she claimed, why were they untouched? Why hadn't she at least thrown them away to keep the lie clean? For a moment I felt almost insulted by the sloppiness of it, as if she thought I would never notice. Maybe she believed the old version of me still existed, the man who trusted too easily and asked too few questions. I opened one of the bottles and ran my thumb over the smooth seal. I tried to remember the last time I had taken any medication from Emily's hands, but the memory wouldn't come. Maybe there was no memory to find. Back in the hallway, I noticed a small box on the entry table. It held old mail letters we had never opened. I sorted through them slowly, searching for anything that might explain the pattern forming in my mind. Near the bottom, I found a Medicare letter from years ago telling me I had opted out of online statements. On the envelope, in Emily's neat handwriting, were the words, "Dad doesn't need to see this." I read it again and again until the letters blurred. I sank into the nearest chair. For the first time in my life, I felt as if the ground beneath me had shifted just enough to make me lose my balance. Emily had woven her way into every corner of my medical life, every financial decision tied to my health. She had done it so quietly, so carefully, that I never felt the threads tightening around me. Marilyn sat beside me and placed her hand over mine. She asked me what was happening. I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I wasn't ready to speak the truth aloud. Not yet. Instead, I told her I needed time to think. I needed time to understand how a ritual that began with trust had turned into something else entirely. She nodded, though I could see the fear creeping into her eyes. I stood and looked toward the staircase that led back to Emily's empty room. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes you listen harder than you should. I knew this was only the beginning, and whatever I found next was not going to make anything easier. I stayed in that chair for a long time after Marilyn went upstairs, listening to the house breathe around me. It was strange how a place could feel both familiar and foreign in the same moment. I kept looking toward the staircase, knowing there were still answers hidden somewhere in that room. answers I had avoided for years without even realizing it. When I finally stood and made my way back up, my legs felt heavier than before, as if the truth itself had weight. Emily's room smelled faintly of her old vanilla lotion, the one she used back in high school. I opened the closet, the same closet where she used to hide birthday gifts and Christmas surprises. Now it held only silence and the last traces of a life she had walked away from without leaving a goodbye note. I pushed a row of winter sweaters aside and saw the edge of a cardboard box peeking out from behind them. It was an old Nike shoebox, the kind she used to keep her running shoes in back when she loved cross-country. I pulled it out slowly, the lid rattling loose, and set it on the bed. When I opened it, any hope I still held on to dimmed in an instant. Inside were receipts from restaurants I had only ever seen on billboards driving through Columbus. Steak dinners for 2 bottles of wine priced higher than my car payments back in the day. Spa receipts that made my hands tremble. One of them listed a $600 facial treatment. I skimmed through them, the numbers blurring together, each one a small betrayal, tied to credit lines using my information. It felt like reading someone else's bank statement, someone careless and wealthy, not a retired man who spent his life clocking shifts at an assembly plant. Under the stack of receipts were Western Union slips, dozens of them. Transfers sent to Mark Dawson. His name alone made my stomach twist. Emily married him at 25 and divorced him 2 years later, a storm of shouting matches and slammed doors I tried not to interfere in. He had a record in Indiana forgery and fraud. I remembered shaking his hand once at Thanksgiving and feeling something slick and empty behind his smile. I never said it to Emily. I never had the heart. My hands tightened around the papers as I kept digging. Near the bottom was a small handwritten note on a torn shopping list pad. If Dad asks, say MRI 840. I felt the room tilt slightly. I sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed my palm to my forehead. The lie was so casual, so rehearsed, as if part of a script she had recited for years. I carried the box downstairs to Marilyn. She sat on the couch with a blanket over her lap, watching the late afternoon light fade through the blinds. When I handed her the shoebox and told her to look, she didn't say a word. She sifted through the receipts one by one, her fingers shaking as she read. Then she stopped at the Western Union slips. Her breath caught, and she looked up at me with tears filling her eyes. She asked how long I thought this had been going on. I couldn't answer. The truth was, I didn't want to know. I still wanted to believe in the little girl who used to draw me pictures and leave them on my nightstand. Marilyn placed the papers down carefully, almost gently, the way someone might set aside a fragile object they're afraid to break. She whispered that she had felt something was wrong for a long time, but she never wanted to hurt me by saying it out loud. I felt something inside me twist, the same way metal does before it snaps. She had carried her doubt alone because she thought I couldn't bear it. I stood up, needing to move, needing air. I walked back upstairs and returned to the closet. Something in me wasn't done searching. Behind the sweaters, in a small pocket sewn into the lining of the closet wall, I found a folded document. When I opened it, I froze. It was a retainer agreement. $2,000 paid to a law office in Dayton. The description said, "Domestic dispute confidential." The year was 2017. That was the same year Emily told us she had signed up for nursing certification classes at Sinclair College. I remembered congratulating her, proud that she wanted a better future. I remembered her hugging me and saying she wanted to take care of people. And all the while she had been hiring an attorney for something she never mentioned. I sat on the floor of her room, surrounded by the shoebox, the torn notes, the lies, and the silence. Piece by piece, a picture formed that I didn't want to look at. Emily had lived an entire second life right under our roof, a life woven out of secrets and excuses and withdrawals I never questioned. She had taken advantage of my trust, used my health as a shield, and carved a path that led somewhere dark enough to need lawyers and wire transfers to a man like Mark. I thought of that empty envelope again, how light it felt. This shoebox felt the opposite. Heavy, dense with truth I had refused to see. Downstairs, I heard Marilyn's footsteps, slow and unsteady, moving toward the kitchen. I knew she was crying again. I knew she was breaking in ways I didn't know how to mend. I picked up the shoebox and stood. My reflection in the window looked older than it had that morning, the lines deeper, the eyes tired. Trust ages a man when it shatters. There were more answers out there. I could feel it. And the next ones weren't going to be any easier. The next morning I woke up before the sun had fully cleared the trees behind our backyard. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the heater kick on. The shoebox, the receipts, the empty envelope, all of it moved around in my head like loose parts in an old machine. I knew sitting there would not change anything. If I wanted real answers, I had to follow the money. Marilyn was at the stove when I walked into the kitchen, scrambling eggs and pretending not to study my face. She could always tell when something weighed on me. I poured myself a cup of coffee and told her I was going into town for a bit, that I needed to stop by the bank. She asked if I wanted her to come along. I told her no, and I tried to make it sound casual, like this was just another errand, nothing more serious than renewing a registration. On the drive to the Fifth Third Bank branch, the roads through Springfield felt narrower than I remembered. I had been going to that same brick building for decades, back when the tellers knew your name and asked about your kids. Some of them still did. The sign out front had been updated, but the parking lot, the cracked curb by the northwest corner, even the stubborn oak tree that refused to grow straight, all of it looked exactly the same. Inside the bank smelled like coffee and printer ink. A young teller greeted me with a practiced smile and asked how she could help. I told her I needed to speak with a manager about my account, something to do with long-term withdrawals and a possible issue with an authorized user. The words felt clumsy, but they got her attention. She led me to a glass-walled office where Mrs. Holland sat behind a desk, stacked with folders. I had known her since the 80s. We used to see each other at local charity events back when her kids and Emily went to the same elementary school. She stood when she saw me, her face warming into something close to genuine concern. She asked what brought me in. I took a breath and told her I needed to review my account history, especially the last couple of decades. I said it had to do with family and health and some questions that had started to keep me up at night. She did not press for details. She simply nodded and turned to her computer. She asked for my identification, then clicked through screens with a quiet frown beginning to form between her eyebrows. After a few minutes, she swiveled the monitor slightly so I could see. There it was in simple lines and numbers. Every Friday, like clockwork, $800 withdrawn in cash. 25 years of it. I felt like I was staring at tree rings from a felled trunk, each one marking a year I had lived without knowing the truth. She asked if those withdrawals looked familiar. I told her they did in a way, but not with the context I had now. I explained that my daughter had been handling my medical expenses, and that I had believed those withdrawals went directly to that. Saying it out loud made me feel foolish. Then she clicked another tab, and her expression changed, the color draining from her face just a little. She told me there was something else she needed to show me. She pulled up a scanned document. At the top it read, "Quitclaim Deed." The property description matched our house on Maple Ridge Drive. Under it were two names, David Miller and Emily Miller. My name was marked as grantor, Emily as grantee. And there at the bottom sat a signature that was supposed to be mine. I leaned in close. The loops and angles were similar. Whoever did it had studied my handwriting, copied the way I curled the M, and dragged out the line at the end of my last name. But it was wrong. The pressure points were off. The strokes hesitated where mine would have flowed. I knew instantly. That was not my hand. My throat went dry. I asked when the document had been filed. Mrs. Holland told me it had been submitted but never fully processed because there were questions about the accompanying medical form. She clicked again and opened another file. This one was a medical incompetency statement. It claimed that I no longer had the capacity to manage my own affairs, that my cognitive functions had declined, and that I required a responsible party to oversee my finances. The physician's signature at the bottom belonged to a doctor I recognized only vaguely, someone who had treated me once many years ago for a minor issue. According to the bank's notes, he had retired 8 years earlier. The date on the form was 3 years ago. Something cold settled in my stomach. It was one thing to be taken advantage of by your own child. It was another to see in writing that someone had tried to declare you unfit to control your own life. Mrs. Holland lowered her voice, then her tone shifting from professional to personal. She told me that the bank had flagged my account multiple times for potential elder abuse. There had been 4 alerts in the last few years, all tied to unusual patterns and the attempt to change property ownership. Each time notification letters were generated and sent to the address on file. But she said those letters were addressed to me, in care of my authorized representative Emily Miller. She asked if I had ever seen any of those notices. I shook my head. If I had, we would not be sitting there now. She sighed, then asked if I was up to seeing one more thing. I said I needed to see all of it, or I would never sleep again. She pulled up a small window on the screen showing video stills from the ATM by the drive-thru. Grainy images time-stamped Friday afternoons month after month. A figure in a dark hoodie baseball cap pulled low face partially covered. The posture, the slope of the shoulders, the jerky, impatient way he moved, something about it tugged at my memory. She zoomed in on one frame, where the man turned his head slightly as he pocketed the cash. Even with the mask, even with the poor resolution, I recognized the jawline, the build, the way he held his arms a little away from his body like he was ready to run if he had to. Mark Dawson. I heard myself say his name out loud, and it sounded strange in that quiet office. Mrs. Holland asked if I knew him. I told her he was my ex-son-in-law, that he had a history with checks and signatures and all kinds of trouble. She sat back, her face tightening. At that moment, everything snapped into place in the worst possible way. This was not just about Emily dipping into my account. This was not a matter of a daughter taking advantage of a trusting father. It looked like someone had been building a case to take my house, my autonomy, my name itself, one piece of paperwork at a time. Emily had been the bridge that made it all possible, and Mark, lurking in the background, looked like the one who knew how to pull the strings. I thanked Mrs. Holland for her honesty and asked her to print everything she legally could for me. She placed the pages into a folder, the paper warm from the printer. When she handed it to me, it felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of 25 years was somehow bound between those thin sheets. On the drive home, I did not turn on the radio. The world outside my windshield moved past in familiar shapes, but none of it registered. I kept seeing that forged signature, that false statement about my mind, that shadowed figure at the ATM. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the front yard. Marilyn watched from the window, worry written all over her face. I sat in the car for a moment longer, the engine ticking as it cooled, knowing that once I walked through that door with this folder in my hand, nothing about our life would ever be simple again. I stayed in the car until the cold finally crept through my jacket and forced me inside. Marilyn met me at the doorway, her eyes tracing the folder in my hand before they ever looked at my face. I told her we needed to sit down. We went to the dining table, the same place where we had paid bills together for decades, where Emily once did her homework, where life felt simple. Now the wood grain looked like a warning. I spread out the papers from the bank. Marilyn read each page slowly, her fingers trembling as they moved across the forged signatures. When she reached the medical incompetency statement, she pressed her hand against her mouth. I tried to explain what Mrs. Holland had told me, but every sentence felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Marilyn said nothing for a long time, then whispered that we needed to call Mason. I agreed instantly. If there was anyone we trusted to untangle this mess, it was him. The next morning, we drove to Mason Carter's law office in downtown Springfield. The building was old brick with creaky wooden floors and walnut paneling that smelled faintly of lemon oil. Mason had handled our wills, our estate plans, even Emily's college paperwork. He knew our family as well as anyone outside our bloodline could. He greeted us with the same warm voice he always used. But when he saw my expression, he closed the office door and asked what had happened. I placed the folder on his desk. He listened without interrupting, his eyebrows drawing closer with each detail. When I finished, he exhaled long and slow, then said, "We needed to take this step by step." He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick binder labeled Financial Inquiry. He flipped it open, asked for my social security number, and typed something into his computer. After a few minutes, he leaned closer to the screen, his face tightening the way it did when he found something he did not like. He asked if I knew about any personal loans taken out in my name. I said I had never taken a loan since retiring from GM. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see. 3 loans. $72,000 total. All filed over the last 8 years. All marked medical necessity. The signatures on them looked like mine at a glance, but I recognized the same awkward hesitation I saw on the forged deed at the bank. Marilyn leaned forward, her hand gripping the arm of her chair. She asked who the witness was. Mason pointed without saying a word. There beside each signature in messy block letters was the name Mark Dawson. A pressure built behind my ribs, something tight and rising. I felt heat in my face, a mixture of shame and rage I had not felt in decades. I asked Mason how this could have happened without me knowing. He explained that some lenders did not require in-person visits, and that notarization could be falsified if someone knew how to exploit the system. Mark, with his record in Indiana and his history of forged checks, would know exactly how. Mason clicked through the files again, then stopped at another document. A 4th loan application still pending approval. $45,000. The address listed for correspondence was not my house on Maple Ridge Drive. It was an apartment complex in Cincinnati, the same area Emily had moved to 3 weeks earlier. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt something break inside me. I remembered the moment in 2015 when Emily asked for a photo of my signature. She had stood in the kitchen with her phone smiling as she said she needed it for a Medicare form. I laughed at how complicated things had become. I told her that if a picture made it easier, she could take as many as she needed. I had handed her the key to all of it without even knowing. Mason leaned back, adjusting his glasses as he studied the forged documents. He said this was not an impulsive mistake. This was structured fraud built piece by piece over years, and he said it with a tone that cut deeper than anger. It carried disappointment, the kind a man feels when he knows innocence has been exploited. Marilyn stood and walked to the window, her hand pressed to the glass, as if the cold air outside might steady her. She asked Mason what we should do. He told her first we needed to confirm whether any lenders attempted to contact authorization representatives. Then his face shifted. He remembered something. He pulled a paper from his filing cabinet, a note from 2 years ago. A lender had attempted to verify loan details with a representative. The person who responded on my behalf had been listed as Emily Miller. Marilyn closed her eyes and whispered that she did not understand how their daughter could have done this. I said nothing. I could not speak without letting something break loose in my voice. Mason printed copies of everything, placing them neatly in a fresh folder. He said we needed to take immediate steps to protect the estate, freeze account changes, and notify lenders that fraud was suspected. He would handle the filings, but he warned that the situation was far deeper than anything we initially thought. I picked up the folder. It felt heavier than the one from the bank, as if each sheet of paper carried a piece of betrayal along with it. As we left the office, the sky had darkened with an early winter cloud cover. The cold cut through my coat as we walked to the car. Marilyn gripped my arm lightly, not for support, but as if she feared letting go might make everything fall apart. Once inside the car, I did not start the engine right away. I stared at the folder in my lap, tracing the edge of it with my thumb. I thought about the years I had trusted Emily without question. The Fridays, the explanations, the way she always spoke with certainty. I thought about how I had never asked for receipts, never checked the statements, never pushed too hard when something felt slightly off. Mason's words echoed in my head. Structured fraud. I realized then that the shoebox in the closet had only been the beginning. The real damage was still buried somewhere deeper, somewhere money flowed and lies lived without air or sunlight. I finally turned the key, the engine rumbling awake. As we pulled away from the curb, I felt something new settle inside me. Not anger yet, not grief, just the cold, steady understanding that the truth was far from fully uncovered, and whatever waited next was not going to be gentle. Back at the house, we moved through the rest of that day like ghosts. Marilyn cooked without eating much, and I pretended to read the newspaper, staring at the same paragraph until the sun went down. The folder from Mason sat on the coffee table, a quiet threat that neither of us wanted to open again. That night, I slept badly, waking every couple of hours with my heart racing, as if I had heard a door open downstairs. The next morning, the phone rang just after 9. Mason rarely called unannounced, so the sound of his voice on the line put me on edge before he even got to the point. He asked if I could come back to the office. There was more. The way he said it made my chest tighten. More had not meant anything good in days. Marilyn came with me this time. She insisted. She said she was done waiting at home while the ground shifted under us. We drove in silence, the tires humming over the same stretch of road we had taken 100 times for happier reasons. In his office, Mason had already cleared his desk. The binder from the day before was open, but now there were extra printouts, pages clipped together with bright metal clamps. He looked tired, like he had spent part of the night chasing numbers across screens. He started with the basics. He told us he had traced the Friday withdrawals that had been converted into wire transfers. The destination account was at Bank of America in Las Vegas, Nevada. The name on the account was one I would have recognized anywhere. Mark Dawson. The room went quiet. Marilyn sank deeper into her chair. I stared at the page, at the routing numbers and dates running down the column. Week after week, year after year, $800 leaving our lives and landing in a city built on chance and desperate men. Mason explained that the account had a pattern consistent with someone who lived on the edge. Large cash withdrawals near casinos, sporadic deposits from unknown sources, overdraft fees that came and went. It painted a picture of a man who never learned a lesson, who treated other people's money like chips on a table. On another sheet, Mason pointed to a list of payments to bail bond companies in Nevada and Indiana. 7 separate transactions in 6 years, each one timed a few days after large withdrawals hit Mark's account. Each one carrying the name of a firm that specialized in getting people out of jail quickly and quietly. Marilyn spoke before I could. She asked Mason if this meant what she thought it meant. That every time Emily told us she needed to cover a scan or a specialist, we might have been paying to get Mark out of a cell somewhere. Mason did not answer directly. He just placed his hand flat on the desk and nodded once. Then he pulled out one more document. I knew before he said anything that this one was different. He slid it across the desk toward me. It was an application for a life insurance policy, $150,000. The insured was me. The beneficiary line held Emily's name. For a moment, the words meant nothing. They were just ink on paper. Then my eyes found the signature at the bottom. My name written in a hand so close to mine that if I had not been looking for the flaws, I might have believed it. The person who signed it had studied me. The pressure was almost right. The flow of the letters almost natural. Almost. I looked up at Mason. He said the policy type was guaranteed issue. No medical exam required. Higher premiums, but easier to obtain if someone knew how to answer the right questions and forge the rest. Marilyn had been very still until that moment. Her hand moved to mine and gripped it hard. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse. Were they planning to hurt you? It hung in the air between us. The question we had both been afraid to say since this began. I did not know how to answer. Maybe the policy was just another layer of greed. Maybe it was a what-if safety net for people who thought of death as an eventual payout instead of a loss. Or maybe it was a sign that the line between theft and something worse had already been crossed in someone's mind. Mason explained that the policy had been approved but never fully funded, which meant no benefit was active. It was like a loaded gun that had not yet been fired. That was meant to be reassuring. Somehow it made me feel worse. He was not done. He showed us records of smaller cash withdrawals made here in Springfield. Not the ones tied to my bank card, but ones that matched transfers from Mark's Las Vegas account. Those withdrawals lined up with dates I remembered as ordinary Fridays. Grocery trips, coffee with old coworkers. Days when I moved through town, unaware that somewhere nearby the man who helped rob me was likely standing at a machine, putting my savings into his pocket. Mason suggested that Mark might have come back to Ohio more than once, maybe to meet Emily, maybe to check on the house he had almost put his name on, maybe just to make sure the old man whose signature he was using was still alive. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the office temperature. I thought about all the times I had been in the backyard trimming branches or fixing the fence, feeling as if someone was watching from the street. I had always dismissed it as nerves. Now I was not so sure. Marilyn asked Mason what we were supposed to do if there was a real danger. Should we call the police? Should we move? Should we change our routines? Mason said we were not at the point of restraining orders yet, but he would contact the appropriate departments and begin a formal fraud complaint that could, if needed, escalate. He said the first step had to be locking down the finances. He would help us notify every institution that my identity might have been compromised. He would make it harder for anyone to open another account or take another loan in my name. It was action. It was something. But it did not answer the question that had taken root in my chest. Why did Emily let it get this far? On the drive home, neither of us spoke. I kept picturing the wires stretching from Springfield to Las Vegas, from my kitchen table to some smoky room where Mark laughed and played cards with other men who did not care whose money they were burning through. By the time we pulled back into our driveway, the doubt that had been circling in my mind took clearer shape. There was only one person who could tell me how all of this started and why it had never stopped. If I wanted to understand the truth, I was going to have to look my daughter in the eye and ask her the questions I should have asked 25 years ago. I did not call Emily that day. I told myself I needed time, that I had to think things through, line up every fact before I opened my mouth. The truth was simpler. I was afraid of what would come out if I did not have control of my voice. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the folders from the bank and from Mason spread out in front of me. Marilyn moved quietly around the house, turning off lights, locking doors, giving me space without leaving me alone. Finally, she sat down across from me, folded her hands, and said what I had avoided thinking. "You have to talk to her, David. Not to the girl you remember. To the woman who did this." Her eyes were steady, even though I could see the hurt behind them. I nodded and reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over Emily's name for a few seconds, then I pressed the call button before I could lose my nerve. She answered on the third ring. Her voice sounded cautious, as if she already knew this was not a casual check-in. I told her we needed to meet, in person, somewhere away from this house. There was a short pause, then she asked where. I picked a coffee shop in Kenwood near the mall, a place halfway between Springfield and her apartment in Cincinnati. Neutral ground. She agreed, but there was no warmth in her voice. Only a kind of worn-out acceptance, like someone taking a test they already knew they had failed. 2 days later, Marilyn and I drove down Interstate 71 in a silence that felt thicker than the traffic. The sky was gray and flat, the kind of Ohio winter sky that made everything look washed out. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on the folder resting against my leg. Every bump in the road felt like a question I had no answer for. The cafe in Kenwood was busy with shoppers taking a break from the mall. The smell of espresso and baked bread filled the air. I spotted Emily at a corner table near the window. She looked smaller somehow, sitting alone with her hands wrapped around a paper cup, her eyes on the parking lot instead of the door. When she saw us walking toward her, she straightened in her seat. For a moment I saw a flicker of the child. She had been the one who used to wave at me from the school bus window. Then her gaze dropped to the folder in my hand, and whatever softness was left drained from her face. We sat down. No hugs. No small talk. The three of us stared at each other, the noise of the cafe fading into a dull background hum. I opened the folder and slid the first stack of papers across the table. Bank statements, withdrawal histories, the list of Western Union transfers. She glanced at them, then at me. I did not say anything. I just waited. Her fingers shook as she flipped through the pages. When she reached the receipts for the fancy dinners and spa days and designer bags, her posture changed. Her shoulders slumped. She whispered that she knew she would have to pay for those someday, but she did not expect it to look like this, laid out in black and white. I handed her the next set. The loans, the forged signatures, the notarizations with Mark's name. Then the life insurance application, my fake signature shining up at us with obscene confidence. For a moment she stared at it without blinking. Then the tears came. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. People at nearby tables glanced over, then politely looked away. This was not their story to witness. Through uneven breaths, she began to talk. She said Mark had come back into her life years after the divorce, that he always claimed he had changed, that he needed one more chance. She said he knew how to make her feel responsible for his failures, how to twist old guilt into new obligations. She told us he had threatened her, that when she tried to stop sending money, he mentioned our house, my health, the fact that old men have accidents all the time, and that sometimes nobody looks too closely when they do. She said that was when she panicked, when she agreed to more, when she let him talk her into using my name, my credit, my history as collateral for his second chances. She insisted the money had not been about luxury, that she had only done what she had to do to keep everyone safe. But the receipts on the table told their own story, and it was not one of bare survival. It was dinners and hotels and spa services in cities she had never mentioned visiting. Marilyn finally spoke. She said Emily had taken far more than money. She had taken trust and turned it into a weapon. She had taken a father who would have given his life for her and used his love as cover for a thief. Her voice did not rise. It did not crack. That made it worse. I waited until Emily's sobs settled into quiet trembling. Then I told her I was done asking why. Intentions could not restore what she had broken. What mattered now was what happened next. I laid out 3 conditions, each one measured, each one non-negotiable. First, she would sign whatever documents Mason prepared to revoke any claim she had tried to make on our house or our assets. Every forged deed, every false representation of my health would be undone as far as the law allowed. Second, she would surrender all control over my finances. No more authorized representative. No more accounts in my name that she could touch. That door, I told her, was closed for good. Third, she would cooperate fully with the legal process. If Mason needed statements, she would provide them. If law enforcement asked for information about Mark, she would not shield him. She had protected him long enough. She stared at me, eyes, red face, pale. For a moment I thought she might refuse. Then something in her seemed to collapse. She nodded slowly and said she would do whatever Mason required. She said she understood if we never forgave her. Marilyn leaned forward, then her gaze hard and clear. You killed something in us that money cannot buy back. Emily flinched as if struck. She reached for Marilyn's hand, but Marilyn pulled it back into her lap. We stood to leave. Emily walked us to the door of the cafe. As people moved around us with shopping bags and coffee cups, she stepped closer and spoke so quietly only I could hear. Be careful, Dad. Mark does not let go. There was a plea in her eyes, something like fear and something like regret. I nodded once and walked away with Marilyn at my side. That night back in Springfield, after Marilyn had gone to bed and the house had settled into its old familiar creaks, the phone rang. The caller ID showed nothing, just a blank. I let it ring twice, then answered. For a moment there was only breathing on the other end. Then a low male voice slid into my ear, calm and cold. You should have left it buried. The line went dead. I sat there with the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the silence, and realized that uncovering the truth had not ended anything. It had only changed the kind of danger we were in. The night after that phone call, I slept in the recliner by the front window, a baseball bat leaning against the wall within easy reach. It felt foolish and necessary at the same time. Every car that passed down our quiet street in Springfield sounded like it was slowing in front of our house. Every shadow from the street lamp looked a little too solid. By morning, the fear had cooled into something harder. Not courage, exactly. More like resolve. I called Mason as soon as the clock hit 9. I told him about the call, the voice that did not bother to hide the warning that sounded more like a promise. He listened without interrupting, then said it was time to stop playing defense. The next few weeks blurred into a steady march of paperwork and signatures. Mason filed for an elder protection order on my behalf, submitting records from the bank, the fraudulent loans, and the attempted transfer of our house. He contacted every institution that had my name on file and flagged my accounts for suspected identity abuse. He had my authorization status updated so that no one, not even family, could act in my name without a fresh in-person verification. The fraudulent quitclaim deed was voided, officially marked as invalid in the county records. It was a simple notation on a screen somewhere in the courthouse downtown, but to me it felt like someone had quietly returned the keys to my own front door. The accounts tied to suspicious activity were frozen while the investigations moved forward. That meant hours on the phone repeating the same story to different people in different offices. but each call chipped away at the structure Mark and Emily had built. Little by little, they lost control of the levers they had been pulling in the dark. Emily met with Mason twice during that time. The first meeting, she walked in alone, shoulders hunched, eyes swollen. The second time, she carried a folder of her own, packed with receipts and notes and timelines she had pieced together to show her role and Mark's. She signed a restitution agreement that day, promising to pay back what she could over the coming years. The numbers were almost laughable compared to what was gone, but it was a start. Mason also insisted she sign a statement acknowledging her part in the fraud and allowing her information to be included if law enforcement pursued charges against Mark. Watching her put her name on that page was like watching someone cut off the last frayed rope tying them to a sinking boat. Not long after Emily called to say she was moving, a friend had offered her a room in Tampa, Florida, near the coast. She said she needed to get out of Ohio, away from Mark's circles, away from the places that still smelled like the life she had ruined. I listened in silence, then told her I hoped she would use the distance to figure out who she wanted to be, when there was no one left to lie to. Mason warned her that with the fraud reports and the protection order on record, her background checks would carry those scars for a long time. Jobs in senior care financial services, anything involving vulnerable adults or access to accounts would likely be closed to her. Actions have a way of following you, he said. She understood. At least she said she did. Weeks passed. Winter settled in for real. The snow came in soft bursts, turning our street into the kind of scene you see on holiday cards. Inside, Marilyn and I learned how to live in our house again. We changed the locks. We moved our important papers into a small fireproof safe. We set up online accounts in my own name this time, with passwords only I knew written in a notebook I kept in my pocket, instead of trusting to memory. The first letter from Emily arrived in early January. A plain envelope, no return address, printed just her name written in the corner in the tight, careful hand she had used since grade school. My stomach tightened when I saw it in the mailbox, as if the paper itself carried a weight I was not ready to lift. It was 4 pages long, all of it handwritten. No excuses, no blaming the stroke I had 25 years ago or the gaps in my memory. She walked through the timeline of her choices when fear had become habit, when habit had turned into greed. She wrote about Mark, about the hold he had on her, the way he could twist her fear into obedience with a few words. She did not ask me to forgive him. She did not even ask me to understand. At the end, she promised to rebuild her life without deception, to make every payment she could on the restitution agreement, even if it took her the rest of my lifetime to finish. She said she knew she had forfeited the right to be part of our daily lives, but she hoped that someday, if the anger cooled, there might be room for some small kind of relationship again. Not the old one. Something more honest, even if it was smaller. I read the letter twice before I gave it to Marilyn. She sat by the window while she read the winter light falling across her face. When she finished, she folded the pages carefully and handed them back. She did not tell me what to feel. She simply said that pain this deep would not disappear, but it did not have to be the only thing left between us and our daughter. Days turned into a new kind of normal. The phone stopped ringing with unknown numbers. The bank stopped calling with fresh surprises. Mason kept us updated when he heard from investigators. Mark had gone quiet since that last threatening call, at least on our end. Somewhere in some other town, he might still be trying the same old tricks on someone else's name. That possibility still made my chest tighten, but it was not mine to carry anymore. One evening near the end of winter, I found myself sitting on the front porch with a blanket over my knees, watching the sun drop behind the bare trees. The sky turned from pale blue to a soft orange, then to that deep purple that comes right before full dark. The neighborhood was quiet, just the distant sound of a television, drifting from a neighbor's open window and the crunch of tires on cold pavement. I thought about the man I had been 25 years ago. Stronger, maybe. Less tired. More trusting. I thought about the moment I handed Emily my medical forms, my passwords, my faith. I thought about how easily love can be used as camouflage, how long you can live under a pattern without seeing the shape it hides. Justice, I realized, is not always a courthouse or a jail cell. Sometimes it is a boundary finally drawn where there never should have been a door. Sometimes it is saying no to someone you used to say yes to without thinking. Sometimes it is choosing to stay standing when everything in you wants to lie down and let the weight of betrayal bury you. I lost money. That is true. But what hurt most was losing the belief that love guaranteed honesty, that being a good father was enough protection against the worst parts of your own child. It was a hard lie to give up. Letting it go left a kind of emptiness in its place. But emptiness is not always the enemy. Sometimes it is just space waiting for something better to grow. As the last of the light faded, I felt a kind of quiet settle in my chest. Not forgiveness yet, not fully, but something like readiness. Readiness to live the years I had left without pretending nothing had happened, without letting bitterness decide who I was going to be. If you are still here with me listening to this whole story, maybe you know a little about what that feels like. Maybe you have your own empty envelopes, your own Friday rituals that were not what they seemed. If you do, you are not alone. Share your own story if you feel like it. Stay a while. Sometimes just hearing that someone else got through it can make your own road feel a little less long.